Last year, my sister and I and my nieces traveled to northern Mexico to seek asylum in the United States. The bus rumbled along the highway as we finally neared Matamoros. It had taken us months to get there from Honduras. All we wanted was safety, a chance to live without fear. It was just after 7:30 when it happened, when, out of nowhere, I heard the shots. And at first I didn't really understand. I thought the noise was firecrackers or something of that nature, and then I saw them. Trucks swarming around us, cutting us off from every direction. As we got closer, the sound of their gunfire was deafening, and panic spread like wildfire through the bus. I held my breath as armed, masked men in military uniforms forced their way inside, and one of the men yelled, "Identification," and everyone on the bus began searching for theirs. My heart pounded as I fumbled for my papers, praying that they wouldn't hurt anyone, but they weren't there to check IDs. They were hunting for us. They were hunting for migrants. They dragged me off the bus along with many others, including my niece, who cried as she was let off outside. Mexican cartels go after Honduran migrants because they're easy targets. Since migrants are often on the move without much protection, cartels take advantage by extorting them, forcing them to work, smuggling drugs, or pulling them into their operations. It's all about preying on people in a very tough spot. And after the men took us, they split us up. I was crammed into a truck with my niece and others, while my sister and her older daughter were shoved into another vehicle. I couldn't even process what was happening. All I could think about was staying alive. For 4 days, we were held captive. The kidnappers took my phone, my cash, even my shoes. They shoved us into a ranch house so packed with other migrants that sometimes there wasn't even space to sit down. We didn't have any food or water, and rats and cockroaches crawled all around us, and every moment stretched on endlessly. For my sister, her situation was even worse. Her youngest daughter had been separated from her, and the kidnappers threatened her life in order to intimidate her. They called our family back in Honduras, demanding thousands of dollars in ransom. "Pay, or you'll never see her again," I remember them saying. My sister told me later how helpless she felt. She couldn't stop imagining the worst, her little girl terrified, alone, or worse. Back in Honduras, our relatives scrambled to gather money. My brother-in-law organized the quick sale of his and my sister's house, but they also had to borrow from people to raise the full ransom amount. The kidnappers wanted the money sent to bank accounts that we later realized were in Peru, and in the end, we paid them about $7,000 USD. On the 5th day, our kidnappers loaded all of us back onto a bus, and I didn't know what was happening, and I was convinced that they were going to kill us and dump us somewhere. Instead, they drove us to a parking lot near the border and left us there, and I remember one of them saying, "Wait here, they'll come for you." And then after that, they drove off and disappeared. Around 10 minutes later, the authorities arrived, and they told us later that they had found us after an anonymous call, and they also said that the massive manhunt launched after our kidnapping forced the captors to release us. Even as we were freed, I couldn't stop thinking about the others. The ranch where I was held still had dozens of migrants crammed inside. In my nightmares, I can still hear their voices and their cries. And now me, my sister, and my nieces are safe in the United States, but that fear still lingers on. We fled Honduras to escape danger, only to face something just as terrible on the journey. All we wanted was a chance to live without fear, and yet, for so many like us, that dream remains just out of reach. I just got back from a family vacation in Los Cabos, Mexico. We stayed in a beautiful western resort that overlooked the ocean, the kind of place where the sunsets are straight out of a postcard. And my family had a routine. By around 9:30, everyone would head back to their rooms to wind down for the night. My parents' vacations have always been all about relaxation, and my older brother, who was working remotely during the trip, only ever just wanted to chill and get dinner by the end of his working day. But then, being a single guy in his early 20s, the appeal of having the bedtime of a retirement home was, and is, completely lost on me. I wanted to explore the nightlife, have some drinks, and meet new people. Because he had to work, my brother, who was usually my wingman on trips like that, was on his best behavior, so I decided to venture out on my own. There was a bar around the corner from our hotel that looked pretty cool, so on the second night, I ended up walking over there once my family had retired to their rooms. And that's where I befriended some of the locals and met Lance, a guy a few years older than me from San Diego who was in town for a cousin's wedding. Lance seemed like a pretty cool guy, and we were both into college football, so that gave us a lot to talk about right away. After our first night hanging out, we made it a nightly thing. I'd wait until my family went to bed, then I'd meet up with Lance and whoever else he was with for beers and some other things. Then, on the third night of the trip, Lance invited me to join him and his friends in downtown Los Cabos for some big party they'd been invited to. I had to turn him down because I'd promised my mom and dad that I'd do this thing with them the next morning, and I didn't want to show up looking like a tub of crap. But I did so very reluctantly because the party was supposedly going to be off the chain. And the next morning, I woke up early and did the thing with my parents. We get along well, so it was fun, but there was still the thought in the back of my mind, something like, damn, that party must have been something. But then that night, Lance invited me to a massive mansion his group had rented on Airbnb. It looked like something out of a Pablo Escobar movie, with infinity pools and sleek white decor. But when I got there, he told me something that sent a chill down my spine. "Man, it's probably a good thing that you didn't come out to the party last night," he said. It got pretty scary." He then proceeded to explain what had happened. The night before, one of his buddies was acting drunk and careless and went to take a piss outside some club that they were at because there was a wait for the bathrooms. He's then on his way back inside when a man approached him and offered him a bump of yayo on a key. And without thinking, his buddy snorted it. But that's when the situation took a very dark turn. The man, who appeared friendly at first, suddenly demanded that he buy the entire bag for about $100, and Lance's friend refused, getting aggressive and belligerent, and things escalated quickly. The man started saying how he worked with the cartel, and then started following Lance's group from bar to bar. Lance said that they didn't think too much of it at first, but then the guy started snapping photos of them and making some phone calls. And before long, there were several other men tailing them, and their threats became more and more direct, and at one point, the guy told them in English, "If he doesn't pay, we're going to kidnap him and hang him from a bridge." Then later, as they were walking to another bar, one of the men following lifted his shirt to reveal a 9mm pistol tucked in his waistband. Lance told me that he had no choice but to step in. He approached the men and tried to de-escalate the situation, keeping calm even as they insisted his friend had stolen from them and would pay with his life. Eventually, Lance offered to take them to an ATM and pay $160 out of his own pocket just to end this whole ordeal, and the men handed him an empty bag as if it were some kind of receipt and then disappeared into the night. But it didn't end there. Later that same night, Lance was walking back when a woman came up to him, flirted briefly, and then yanked his $200 chain clean off of his neck after pointing a gun directly in his face. And he was stunned, and said that he just stood there as the girl disappeared into the crowd. And the worst part, his friend and the same guy who started the whole mess refused to take any responsibility. He didn't apologize or even offer to split the $160 Lance had paid to save him. Instead, he had the nerve to blame Lance for getting involved. When Lance finished telling me the story, I was pretty speechless. And it was hard to believe how much he'd gone through in one night, all because he was trying to do the right thing. And I told him straight up that I was relieved that I hadn't made it out that night. Who knows how much worse things could have gotten. And the whole experience was a true wake-up call for me. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that you should never accept free drugs from strangers, as it's never free. It always comes with a price, and sometimes that price is your safety, or even your life. Way back in the late spring of 2017, my family and I went on a vacation to Cancun, fulfilling a long-held dream of visiting Mexico. We were eager to experience the country's stunning landscapes and rich history, vibrant culture, and, of course, its incredible food. While much of our trip was as magical as we'd hoped, one incident on our first day left a deep and lasting scar on our memories of the place. We planned a visit to the iconic Chichen Itza pyramids, a must-see landmark that's a bit of a drive from Cancun's bustling hotel zone. And to make the journey easier, we rented a car, relying on Google Maps to guide us. The drive started early in the morning, and the route took us down a long, very isolated road. At first, nothing seemed unusual. It was quiet and serene, with the sunrise casting a golden glow over the landscape. But as we continued, our day took a dark turn. Out of nowhere, a group of men in uniforms flagged us down. They were federal police officers, clearly identifiable by their uniforms with Yucatan insignias. Since Chichen Itza is in the neighboring state of Yucatan, we assumed that this might be a checkpoint near the state border. However, things quickly became unsettling. The officers informed us that everyone in the car should have been wearing seatbelts. In Colombia, where we're from, it's typically only for the driver and front passenger to buckle up, so we hadn't realized that we were really breaking any rules. They said the violation would result in a fine, but the conversation soon shifted into a very disturbing direction. They asked us where we were from, and when we answered Colombia, their demeanor turned hostile. They ordered my father out of the car and led him to a spot out of our sight. At the same time, they made derogatory remarks about Colombians, calling us criminals and claiming we were responsible for many of the crimes in Yucatan. The hostility in their tone and the fact that they were heavily armed sent a wave of panic through us. It didn't help that the road was completely deserted, except for a few passing cars that the officers ignored, with the isolation making our fears much worse. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours before my father returned. He looked shaken, but composed, and once we were back in the car and driving away, he explained what had happened. The officers had questioned him aggressively, asking who he was, what his job was, and whether anyone knew he was in Mexico. They let him go only after he gave them money, a bribe to avoid escalating the situation. As we continued our drive, an overwhelming thought lingered in the car. Those men could have harmed us or worse, and no one would have known. And the encounter felt far more sinister than a routine case of police corruption. Their threats and behaviors left us deeply unsettled and incredibly grateful that the situation hadn't turned out worse. Thankfully, the rest of our trip in Mexico was wonderful. We explored its beautiful sights, enjoyed its food, and met many warm and welcoming people. However, that bitter experience on the first day remains etched in our memory, a stark reminder of how quickly things can take a terrifying turn. This happened a couple of summers ago during a road trip my boyfriend and I took while vacationing in Mexico. We were driving along a remote rural road on the Yucatan Peninsula, far from the main highways after spending the morning exploring a cenote. We were fairly familiar with the area, having visited the region a few times before, and typically, the only people we'd see out there were locals in small pickups or the occasional tourists. That day was beautiful, sunny and warm and perfect for a road trip. We were cruising along when we spotted a man stepping out of the jungle and waving us down frantically. My boyfriend slowed the car and rolled down the window to see what was going on while I stayed in the passenger seat. And from the moment we stopped, I got a very odd vibe. The man looked to be in his late 40s or early 50s, but he was wearing clothes that didn't quite fit the weather, a heavy, dusty flannel shirt over khaki pants and scuffed boots. He was pale, clean-shaven with messy hair and glasses that magnified his intense gaze. And what stood out most, though, was how calm and almost mechanical he sounded when he explained his situation. In an accent that sounded European, he started explaining how his car battery had died, apparently because he'd been listening to the radio while fishing, and asked if we could give him a jump start. Wanting to help and believing in road karma, we agreed, but the whole situation just felt very off. He said his car was just down a small side road a little further ahead, and he began walking, and we slowly followed in the car. My boyfriend and I joked nervously about him leading us into the jungle to rob or kill us, but beneath the humor, we were both very uneasy. After about 150 meters or so, we turned onto a very narrow, overgrown dirt path barely visible from the main road. The jungle loomed large on both sides of us, and the path opened up into a small clearing where his car was parked. It was an older beige sedan, completely unsuited for the rough roads in this area. The trunk was oddly opened, with a blanket draped over it, and the hood was already popped. My boyfriend got out to grab our jumper cables, where I slid into the driver's seat, keeping the engine running. The man stayed near my boyfriend, chatting casually about how his fishing buddy had left earlier, but something about his tone just felt very off. His friendliness seemed forced, and he hovered awkwardly, watching as my boyfriend connected the cables. I couldn't shake my unease and discreetly scanned the car for anything I could use as a weapon, telling myself that I was overreacting but unwilling to let my guard down. When the car finally started, the man got out and thanked us, but his demeanor was unnervingly intense. My boyfriend quickly unhooked the cables, tossed them into the back seat without bothering to pack them away, and climbed into the car. The moment his door closed, I reversed back down the narrow path, branches scraping the sides of our car as I maneuvered out. The man stood there, watching us the entire time. Once we were back on the main road, we both felt a wave of relief. My boyfriend admitted that the man's behavior had made him uncomfortable too, and we couldn't help but question the situation. Where was his fishing gear? Why was his car parked in such an out-of-the-way spot, and was his battery even dead to begin with? We never knew for sure, but I can't shake the feeling that staying alert and acting quickly may have saved us from something far worse. Last year, my boyfriend and I took a trip to Mexico to celebrate our anniversary. Now, we speak a fair amount of Spanish, enough to get around comfortably, and have been enjoying the trip so far. We started in Playa del Carmen and then moved to Cancun, hoping for better beaches with less seaweed. We relied on taxis to get around, including the hour-long ride from Playa to Cancun, and everything had run smoothly up to that point. On our anniversary, we spent the day exploring, soaking up the sun and enjoying the local vibe before heading back to our hotel to freshen up for a special evening. We decided to try a place called Toro Rojo, famous for their super nachos, and as a nacho lover, I was beyond excited. According to Google Maps, it wasn't far, so we decided to walk. We set off, full of anticipation, but after walking around 45 minutes along a bustling highway, I checked my phone again and realized that we still had over an hour to go on foot. The distance seemed much longer than expected, and frustrated and hungry, we decided to just hail a taxi to save some time because those nachos and daiquiris were calling my name. A taxi pulled over, and then we hopped in and told the driver that we wanted to go to Toro Rojo. He claimed that he didn't know where it was, and so we handed him my phone with Google Maps open. The directions were simple. Drive straight, take a U-turn, and the restaurant would be on the left. He started driving, and I kept an eye on the map from over his shoulder to ensure that we stayed on track. And as we finally approached that U-turn, the driver didn't slow down. Instead, he passed it. I figured maybe he wasn't familiar with the exact spot and gave him the benefit of the doubt, and then he passed another U-turn, and another. And by now, alarm bells are going off in my head. I grabbed my boyfriend's phone and discreetly typed, "He keeps missing the U-turns. Tell him that's the other way." My boyfriend calmly told the driver in Spanish, "It's the other way," and the driver ignored him and picked up some speed, now going about, I think, 20 miles over the speed limit. And my heart was racing, and I could barely breathe. The driver muttered something like, "My English is not good," which made no sense since we were speaking Spanish, and my boyfriend tried again, this time firmer, saying something like, "Here is fine," and the driver didn't stop. My boyfriend raised his voice and started shouting something in Spanish, and finally, the driver slowed down. I remember, as soon as the car stopped, I leapt out, and by that point, I was shaking with fear. The driver demanded $30 USD, an absurd amount for such a short ride, but my boyfriend handed it over without hesitation, just wanting the situation to end. We sprinted in the opposite direction, our hearts pounding, and when we checked Google Maps, we realized the driver had taken us 9 miles outside of Cancun, leaving us stranded like 12 miles from our hotel. And it was pitch black, with nothing around us but trees and empty road. It was 11 p.m. and our cash was almost gone since the driver had taken most of it. And desperate, I called my parents, who stayed on the phone with us while we walked toward the nearest hotel. It was over an hour on foot. Being in that kind of pitch darkness, it was terrifying, and every sound made me jump. At one point, a red Mini Cooper appeared out of nowhere, slowly following us, and the windows rolled down, but the driver didn't say anything. My boyfriend, already on edge, banged on the side of the car and yelled some sort of expletive, I'm not really sure, and the car sped off. Not long after, we encountered 2 stray dogs ahead of us, and my boyfriend whispered, "What if they aren't friendly?" and picked up a couple of rocks just in case, and it broke my heart. Being pre-vet, I adored animals, but safety came first, obviously. And luckily, the dogs were sweet and only wanted attention, and we pet them briefly before getting back on the move. Then, as if the night couldn't get any worse, a truck pulled up alongside of us. The driver asked if we needed a taxi, but it was clearly an unmarked car, and we just waved him off. But he didn't drive away. Suddenly, those stray dogs sprinted toward the truck, barking ferociously, their demeanor completely changing. Without hesitation, We turned and ran the other way, trusting those dogs' instincts. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached a hotel where we managed to get a taxi back to our hotel safely. We were physically and emotionally drained, and while we made it out unharmed, the experience left us very shaken. I don't know if we were just lucky or if something more sinister was at play, but it's left me very reluctant to visit that part of Mexico again. When I was younger, every summer and nearly every New Year, my family would pack the car and set off on a road trip to visit our relatives in Mexico. It was a tradition, one filled with excitement, snacks, and long hours on the road. Those trips always felt like an adventure. We never had any problems, at least until one particular trip we went on when I was 8 years old. As usual, we left our home in North Texas at around 6 p.m. The plan was the same as always, drive through the night and arrive at our destination by the morning. Around 2 a.m. we crossed the border into Mexico, but that's when things took a very strange turn. Driving on the long, empty stretch of freeway in the middle of the desert was nothing unusual. It was pitch black outside except for the twinkling stars above and the occasional silhouette of a cactus. The road was desolate and other cars were few and far between. I was in that half-asleep, half-awake state that kids are often in during long car rides, faintly aware of my surroundings as I drifted in and out of consciousness. And that's when I heard my mom speak up, and her voice low but tense. "Miguel." My father. "The car behind us. It's been following us since we left Laredo." My dad glanced in the rearview mirror and shrugged it off before saying something like, "A lot of cars use this road. It's probably just heading to Reynosa or another town." My mom didn't seem convinced, and she kept glancing back. I could feel her unease, and it made me nervous too. My siblings and I, now fully awake, became fixated on this mysterious car. We peeked through the gaps in the luggage piled high in the rear of the car, trying to get a better look, and it was hard to tell, much in the dark, but those headlights stayed stubbornly behind us, mile after mile. I remember how nervous we all got when my mom said, "He's getting closer." And this time, her voice was sharp with fear. We turned again to watch, and sure enough, the car was inching closer to ours. Too close. The headlights blazed, glaring into our car like an interrogation lamp. "He's too close, Miguel," my mom said firmly, her voice rising slightly. My dad didn't panic, but I could see his grip tighten on the wheel. He didn't slow down, didn't stop, and didn't speed up either. He just kept driving steadily, and the car behind us followed, unwavering. The tension of the car was suffocating, and for the next 30 minutes the car behind us played a sort of cruel game. It would back up just enough to give us a false sense of relief, only to speed up and press its blinding headlights right against our car again. It felt intentional, like the driver knew how terrified we were and was enjoying it, and I held my breath every time it got closer, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, up ahead, my mom spotted something. A police car parked on the side of the road. "Pull over, Miguel. Right in front of the police. Do it now," she commanded. Without hesitation, my dad complied, pulling our car to a stop directly in front of the parked police cruiser. The mysterious car didn't stop. It sped past us, disappearing into the darkness ahead. The policeman approached our car looking understandably confused, and my mom wasted no time explaining, her words tumbling out in a sort of frantic rush. She described how the car had been following us, tailgating us, and behaving aggressively, and the officer did take her seriously. He explained that robbers and carjackings were common on those deserted highways, especially in the dead of night. Gangs and criminals often targeted unsuspecting travelers, and hearing this sent chills down my spine. I clutched my seatbelt tighter as my mom's fears were validated, and to reassure us, the officer offered to drive behind us for a while to ensure that we were safe. We gratefully accepted his help, feeling a wave of relief as the cruiser pulled out behind us. And 10 minutes later, our relief turned to dread. There on the side of the road was the car, the same car that had been following us for miles. It was parked in the shadows, almost like it was waiting. My mom's breath caught and my dad tensed. None of us said a word, and we all knew that we had narrowly escaped something far worse that night. The police cruiser stayed behind us for the next stretch of the journey, and eventually, the tension in the car eased. But that image of the car waiting in the darkness has stayed with me ever since, and to this day, I wonder what would have happened if my mom hadn't spotted that police car in time. Back in 1997, a man named Ociel Guillen took control of Mexico's Gulf cartel following the arrest of the organization's leader. The power vacuum left behind by his predecessor's capture sparked a violent turf war in which rival cartels faced off against each other as the Mexican military tried in vain to keep the peace. As the conflict raged on, the Gulf cartel began to suffer heavy losses to both men and material, and for a while, they were dangerously close to being overwhelmed and annihilated. But luckily, Ociel Guillen had an ace up his sleeve, and that ace was a man named Arturo Guzman de Sena. De Sena was born into a poor working-class family in the Mexican city of Puebla on January 13th of 1976. Like many of his peers, De Sena realized that his best chance of escaping economic hardship was to join the military. So on his 16th birthday, he volunteered to join the Mexican army. De Sena proved a talented soldier, so talented in fact that he was chosen to undergo selection for an elite group of airborne special forces known as the Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales, or GAFE for short. After joining the unit, De Sena received training in both counterinsurgency tactics and the interdiction of narco-traffickers, and first saw action during the 1994 Chiapas uprising, in which more than 30 rebels were either killed or captured by De Sena's squadron. His unit received praise for their decisive victory over the rebels, but some noticed an exceedingly chilling detail regarding the condition of the slain insurrectionists. Once they'd been killed, and the shooting died down, De Sena and his men had apparently gathered up the bodies of the dead rebels, and then set about dissecting and mutilating their corpses. To his commanders, the desecration of rebel bodies was something that they could overlook due to the overall success of the operation, yet De Sena felt hideously underappreciated. Mexican special forces are paid slightly more than their regular army counterparts, but the amount still pales in comparison with what De Sena believed he was worth. He became more and more bitter, watching his superiors rake in millions of pesos in bribe money while he and his comrades lived on crumbs. Then one day, De Sena received a home visit from two mysteriously well-dressed men. He was reportedly given 100,000 pesos, along with a piece of paper with a phone number written on it, and then was told, "If you're willing to work, there's plenty more where that came from." Less than 24 hours later, De Sena was setting up a secret meeting with his potential new employer, and when they met, he realized how they had all that money to burn. De Sena was being sought out to head up the Gulf cartel's brand new military wing, one that would defend them from the incursions of both rival gangs and the Mexican authorities. At first, De Sena approached only his closest comrades in the GAFE and put forward a very simple proposition: join his new unit, enjoy bountiful compensation, and continue hunting narco-traffickers. The only catch was, they'd be doing so on behalf of the Gulf cartel. And by that point, De Sena's former comrades were so jaded that working for the cartel seemed no different than working for the government. Both were morally bankrupt, but only one had the money to pay them what they deserved. It's also believed that since a huge political shift was occurring around this time, many Mexican Special Forces soldiers believe they'd be held accountable for crimes they'd committed during the Chiapas uprising. And so, rather than risk having their service rewarded with prison time, they jumped ship and joined Arturo De Sena in his brand new unit. Within just a few months, De Sena had put together a group of 13 exceptionally well-trained and viciously ferocious killers, all of whom have served with him in the GAFE. They organized themselves in the exact same manner as their former Special Forces unit, allowing for the lightning-fast deployment of small but highly mobile teams of lightly armed but heavily motivated personnel. De Sena also employed the same military communication style as was employed in the GAFE, with members of the unit being referred to only by their call sign. In Mexico, the radio code for lower-level federales was Y, or Yankee, meaning individual officers would be referred to as Yankee 1 or Yankee 2, etc. But higher-ranking officers, those in charge of an entire city or county, would be referred to by the radio code Z, or Zeta. Seeing as he was the leader of this new paramilitary unit, De Sena was given the call sign Zeta 1, while his second-in-command was referred to as Zeta 2. Soon, every member of the unit had a Zeta call sign, which in turn gave rise to the name they're known by today, Los Zetas. At first, Los Zetas focused exclusively on helping Ocio Guillen consolidate his position as the head of the Gulf Cartel, and they did so with surgical efficiency. They castrated his rivals, skinned his enemies alive, and struck fear into the hearts of all who might challenge the cartel's dominance. As their victories mounted, so did their membership, as dozens of corrupt police officers, disgruntled Special Forces soldiers, and even handfuls of former U.S. Army personnel sought to join their ranks. Yet the Zetas didn't allow just anyone into their organization. Applicants were required to possess a certain level of fitness and weapons training, and those who didn't impress the original 13 Zetas were subject to extreme psychological torture to determine if they had what it takes. Those who passed were welcomed into a brotherhood, told that they were mentally and physically superior to other men, and that wealth and prominence were theirs to be won by bloodshed. Over the decade that followed, and despite dozens of their members being arrested or killed, Los Zetas grew more and more powerful. And by the year 2010, they both outnumbered and outclassed their parent organization, and after fearing that their pet monster had become too big to control, the cartel decided the Zetas needed a reminder of who was in charge. The situation came to a head when cartel lieutenant Samuel Borrego was shot by a Zetas member after an argument over a drug trafficking corridor. The cartel demanded that the Zetas hand over the man's killer. Their response was to declare war. The Gulf Cartel was almost completely unprepared for what followed. After several of their top figures were assassinated by crack teams of Zetas operators, the cartel deployed hundreds of their foot soldiers to the border towns of northern Tamaulipas. The vehicles they drove were marked with acronyms and insignia such as CDG, XXX, or M3, all of which denoted them as belonging to the Gulf Cartel, and they were armed to the teeth. But no matter how many gun trucks or machine pistol-toting sicarios they possessed, the cartel were in no position to weather the coming storm. Initially, the cartel deployed so many armed men to the streets of Reynosa that they believed the Zetas were too afraid to face them. Daylight came and went, and not a shot was fired in anger. But as soon as the sun set, the Zetas began their offensive. Using the cloak of darkness to negate the tactical advantage afforded by the cartel's heavy machine guns, the Zetas operators used night vision goggles and silenced submachine guns to wreak havoc among the cartel's ranks. They sprang from the shadows at close quarters, executed well-rehearsed room clearance drills, and by dawn, the city was awash with cartel blood. Following the capture of Reynosa, the city of Nuevo Laredo fell, then the border town of Matamoros in turn. Entire cities were paralyzed by the violence, but in the end, Los Zetas emerged victorious. And by the summer of 2010, they controlled over 200 miles of the U.S.-Mexican border territory, all of which was crucial to the illegal narcotics trade. In desperation, the Gulf Cartel turned to their old rivals, the Sinaloa, and begged for their assistance. The cartel then split into two distinct groups, those who wished to make peace with Los Zetas for the sake of their own survival, and those who wished to wipe them out. Many of those in the former group ended up joining the Zetas, while those in the latter became little more than vassals for the Sinaloa and Michoacan cartels, who formed an alliance due to their mutual fear of the Zetas. Nowadays, the Gulf Cartel still technically exists, but it has never fully recovered following its not-so-civil conflict with the group it had a hand in creating. The capture of the northern Tamaulipas border corridor marked the end of Los Zetas' first major battle with the Gulf Cartel, but the war was not yet over. What remained of the cartel had retreated south to lick their wounds, and Los Zetas had yet to properly stamp their authority on the twin states of Tamaulipas and Nuevo León. In order to assert complete control over the region's illegal activities, the Zetas' leadership decreed that all criminal enterprises owed them taxes payable in either cash, material, or labor. Many groups complied with the order, but not all were so quick to pay tribute to their new overlords. Given its proximity to the Texan border, the state of Tamaulipas is home to dozens of criminal organizations who traffic in both narcotics and people. Many of these groups pledged fealty to the Los Zetas and began handing over exorbitant sums in taxes, but others seemed to view the Zetas as being beneath them and began adopting identical tactics in an attempt to protect their fiefdoms. In the city of San Fernando, gunmen aligned with the Gulf Cartel ambushed a group of Los Zetas operators and then strung their mutilated bodies from streetlights. The Zetas' response was nothing short of barbaric. On the night of August 22, 2010, a convoy of 73 Central American migrants were passing through Tamaulipas on their way to the United States border. When they reached the outskirts of San Fernando, they found a group of Los Zetas operators had set up a roadblock, and after hijacking the migrants' vehicles at gunpoint, the Zetas drove them out to a secluded ranch somewhere nearby. There, the migrants were forced out of their vehicles, marched into a warehouse, and told to kneel against a wall. Then, one by one, they were shot, execution style, in the back of the head. Only one of the 72 migrants survived the execution, when the bullet meant to kill him somehow passed through his jowl without severing any major blood vessels. The survivor then walked nearly 14 miles until he reached a checkpoint manned by Mexican Marines. At first, the authorities had their doubts regarding the veracity of the survivor's story, but after a group of Marines were dispatched to the ranch, they confirmed that the story was true. Authorities then asked the survivor to give them a complete account of his brief time in captivity, and this is what he told them. The 18-year-old Ecuadorian who called himself Luis had traveled from his home country of Honduras and had joined the migrant convoy once he reached Tamaulipas. Following their sudden kidnap, he and his fellow migrants were held overnight in what appeared to be an abandoned rural house prior to being transported to the ranch in the morning. Then, once they'd been forced inside the warehouse, each migrant was bound and blindfolded before being shoved up against a wall. Luis said a voice started calling out to them, telling them to lie down, be quiet, and not to scream. And that's when the shooting started. Once everyone was dead, Luis said that he took off out of the warehouse and then walked all night until he saw a small light in the distance. There, on the outskirts of a small town, he found the roadblock manned by Mexican Marines. When news of the massacre hit headlines across Mexico, President Felipe Calderón sent his most profound condolences to the families of those affected and said the murders were the result of the war between Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel. Some speculated the migrants were targeted because their traffickers were being financed by the Gulf Cartel, and that killing them was the Zetas' way of choking off the cartel's profits, whereas others have suggested that the first San Fernando massacre was merely a dry run for the horrors that would follow. Mexican Federal Highway 101 is the largest and most important transportation system in the state of Tamaulipas. It extends from the border city of Matamoros to the state capital, Ciudad Victoria, and around March of 2011, locals began referring to it as El Camino de la Muerte, or the Road of Death. Those who traveled along the highway between 2010 and 2011 used to see burned-out vehicles, shot-up trucks on the side of the road, and dead bodies, often decapitated, that the cartels would leave behind. Others witnessed the Gulf Cartel checkpoints installed from Padilla to San Fernando, which served as an early warning system for any Los Zetas incursions into the area, and these incursions were frequent. Cadres of Los Zetas gunmen would sometimes drive into the area, mostly at night, to terrorize just about anyone they came across. They would rob people, kill people, violate their women, and then at one point, Los Zetas started stealing entire busloads of innocents. One driver claimed that after masked gunmen forced him to a stop, 12 of his passengers were pulled off and then forced into a separate vehicle at gunpoint. One witness stated that the gunmen would point at certain passengers, all of whom happened to be young men, and say, You're coming with us." Once the Zetas had taken their prisoners, the bus would then be ordered to leave. This horrifying variety of wholesale, seemingly random kidnapping happened time and time again throughout March of 2011. The families of those taken begged local authorities to act, and almost everyone was aware that Los Zetas were the blame. Not only did authorities have no idea why the Zetas were dragging young men off of buses, they had no idea where they were taking them. Yet just a few weeks later, all of their questions were answered and the conclusions were nothing short of horrifying. On April 6th of 2011, local authorities were informed that a mass grave had been discovered just outside the city of San Fernando. A total of 59 sets of human remains were discovered over the days that followed, many of which belonged to those who had been snatched off the buses in the weeks prior. 2 days later, the Secretary General of Tamaulipas announced the discovery of 13 more bodies, bringing the total body count to 72. But unlike the first San Fernando massacre, which had targeted Central American migrants, the bodies recovered from the mass graves were all belonging to Mexican citizens. On April 10th, 4 additional mass graves were uncovered, and then 2 days after, another set of graves were found. And this process repeated itself until June 7th of 2011, when a final death toll of 193 was announced. The discovery of so many corpses sent shockwaves through Mexican society, and entire news cycles were dedicated to the investigation. But when the truth behind the second San Fernando massacre emerged, it horrified even the most cynical of investigators. On June 11th of 2011, a reporter from the Houston Chronicle named Dane Schiller shared details of an interview he conducted with a supposed Zetas associate. He claimed to know where the kidnapped were being taken, but the truth was, it wasn't Los Zetas that were killing them. They were killing each other. Some said it was Zetas' novel method of recruitment. Others said it was nothing but a sick form of entertainment to the psychopathic cartel members. But after being dragged from their buses and transported to an unknown location, the kidnapped victims were forced into mortal combat with one another. They call it Mexico's next top hitman, the anonymous associate claimed. They give them knives, hammers, machetes, all kinds of things. Then they make them cut each other to pieces. I earn way more money with the Zetas, but I know the kind of evil crap they do. They like to brag about it. The Zetas associate also claimed that on one occasion, one of the unwilling victors of the forced gladiatorial combat completely lost his mind. The young man became completely detached from reality and didn't seem to believe what was happening was real. The Zetas told him he was dreaming, and that in order to wake up, he had to do exactly as they told him. The Zetas then drove the young man towards San Fernando, put a gun in his hand, and then pointed him in the direction of a Gulf cartel checkpoint. The young man walked forward, raised the pistol, and was immediately gunned down by the waiting sicarios. Another cartel associate who was arrested in Texas around the same period claimed the gladiator fights had been arranged on the order of a high-ranking Zeta lieutenant named Miguel Trevino Morales. Yet he also claimed that not all the participants were unwilling. The Zetas had instituted a policy of forced conscription around San Fernando as a means of weaponizing the Gulf's own support base against them, but they also accepted many volunteers into their ranks during that time. This means that, for all intent and purpose, a terrified, pacifistic kidnap victim could have been forced to fight a highly motivated, highly psychopathic individual who wanted to prove their value to some of the most monstrous men in Mexico. In the aftermath, several Los Zetas lieutenants were apprehended by police, including the mastermind of the original San Fernando massacre. The Mexican Attorney General offered a reward of $15 million for information leading to the capture of those responsible, and the information that flooded in led to the arrest of 82 people thought to be directly and indirectly involved. 16 of those arrested were municipal police officers in San Fernando, and according to investigations, the officers protected Los Zetas and helped them covering up the killings. The fallout proved a massive hit to both the Zeta structure and their strategic capabilities, but wounded animals often prove the most dangerous. The Grupo Royal Company runs a chain of casinos and entertainment venues in Monterrey, Mazatlan, and Los Cabos, and during the late summer of 2011, a group of armed Los Zetas men marched into the company's Monterrey casino and demanded a percentage of the monthly profits. The casino's manager told the men that they couldn't afford to pay protection money to Los Zetas, as they already made a sizable monthly contribution to representatives from another organization, most likely the Gulf Cartel. The manager advised that if they wanted a share of the protection money the casino paid, they should speak to the cartel. But the Zetas preferred action over dialogue. And just before 2 p.m. on August 25th of 2011, 12 Zetas operatives met for lunch at a restaurant on Gonzalitos Avenue, just a few blocks away from the Monterrey Casino. Over a few plates of cabrito, a regional specialty which involves charbroiling the entire unbutchered carcass of a goat, the operatives went over their plan and then got to work. About an hour later, the Zetas operators were spotted at a gas station in the neighborhood of Valle Verde, filling cans with gasoline. The station clerk said that they drove off without paying, but was too frightened to call the police. 50 minutes later, a convoy of 4 vehicles pulled into the parking lot of the Monterrey Casino, and the 9 heavily armed Zetas operatives stormed its front entrance. In the aftermath, some survivors claimed that after forcing their way into the casino, the Zetas did not target any of its occupants, and instead fired their weapons into the air in order to gain everyone's attention. The operatives then ordered everyone out of the casino before dousing the place with gasoline and setting it ablaze. However, not all the casino's visitors understood what was going on. Upon hearing the gunmen announce themselves as representatives of Los Zetas, a huge proportion of the casino's occupants assumed a massacre was about to take place. They didn't wait around to hear what else the gunmen had to say. They simply ran off to find emergency exits or suitable hiding places. It's believed around 150 people attempted to hide themselves throughout the casino complex, but when they realized the Zetas had merely set the place on fire before withdrawing, panic surged and the people stampeded. Around 100 of them made it out alive, but as the Monterey Fire Department doused the flames and began attempting to rescue those trapped inside, they discovered 52 asphyxiated corpses strewn all over the building. Following a brief investigation, the firefighters announced that the casino's emergency exits had been locked at the time of the raid, suggesting not only inside involvement, but also that the Zetas did indeed intend to inflict civilian casualties. In the span of just 190 seconds, the Zetas had inflicted a major blow to the Gulf Cartel's funding, as well as dooming 52 innocent people to death. Although the war between Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel had been waging for months, the Monterey Casino attack was the first time the conflict drew the attention of the international media. U.S. President at the time Barack Obama called the attack brutal and reprehensible, while Secretary General Ban Ki-moon called it a deplorable act of violence. Global human rights charity Amnesty International demanded a detailed investigation of the incident and declared their solidarity with the families of the victims. The situation in Tamaulipas has become a source of immense embarrassment for the Mexican government, both internationally and domestically. So to reestablish trust between the state and the people they were bound to serve, President Calderon ordered a surge in regional counter-narcotics operations. In May of 2011, a battalion-sized task force of around 650 men, comprised mostly of Mexican Marines and Special Forces, were sent to Tamaulipas to combat the drug cartels. The task force was supported by police, military reservists, and civilian volunteers, and focused not only on physically combating Zetas and cartel gunmen, but also winning the hearts and minds of local civilians by providing them with healthcare, reconstruction services, and even free haircuts. Yet the one thing holding the project back was the one institution whose job it was to advance their cause. Police corruption in Tamaulipas was so endemic that in November of 2011, the municipal governor essentially suspended the entire force and allowed the Mexican Marine Corps to step in and enforce the law. Only then could the cleanup operation in Tamaulipas really gain any traction. But once it did, the Zetas' downfall was inevitable. By the beginning of 2012, Los Zetas were no longer the same elite fighting force that had gone to war with the Gulf Cartel 2 years earlier. The quality of their leadership, manpower, and equipment had been seriously degraded, not only by the resistance of the cartels and their allies, but also by the continual operations of the Mexican Marines. Throughout 2012, the Marines constructed 4 additional operational bases in the state of Tamaulipas, and they brought the hammer down on Los Zetas wherever they found them. On October 9th, the Mexican Navy confirmed that Zetas Supreme Commander Heriberto Lascano had been killed in a firefight with Mexican Marines near the Texan border. Lascano had the call sign Zeta 3, meaning he was one of the group's founding members, and his death was a huge blow to the organization's morale as well as its effectiveness. The following year, a member of other Zeta lieutenants was apprehended or killed, and several of their armories were captured by the Marines. By the end of 2014, International Crisis Group researcher Daniel Herring stated that Los Zetas were on their way out. The old networks have been disrupted, and the Zetas have splintered, Herring said. They're now a series of smaller factions, with the primary competitors for power being the Hell Squadron, the old-school Zetas, and the Cartel de Noresta. The rise of Los Zetas may well have been followed by their abrupt downfall, but their influence on the Mexico narco culture has been indelible. Back in the 90s, the cartels hadn't yet stooped to that kind of savagery that they engage in today. Instead, they used what could be referred to as codes of murder. For example, a bullet through the back of the head marked the dead man as a traitor, while a bullet through the temple made it clear that they'd been executed by a rival gang or cartel. Many believe that the first incident of cartel barbarism occurred in September of 2006, when sicarios of La Familia Michoacana threw several severed heads onto the dance floor of a Michoacana nightclub. But in reality, This incident was merely the first that received international attention, and the practice of beheading one's enemies was introduced many years earlier. As we've already discussed, the Zetas spent their first few years recruiting only former and serving Special Forces operators. But recruitment was not confined to those of Mexican birth, and as Los Zetas extended their reach into Guatemala in the late 90s, they found rich pickings among a group known as Los Cabiles. The Cabiles are Guatemala's equivalent of the Green Beret. They specialize in counterinsurgency operations and jungle warfare tactics and endure training which pushes recruits to mental and physical extremes. Those who earn the right to sleep are permitted to do so for only 3 hours, and before recruits are permitted to eat, they must run 2 miles in 8 minutes or less while wearing full combat gear. Recruits are then given exactly 30 seconds to eat before their food trays are taken away from them. During the final stages of training, recruits are flown deep into the jungle in the middle of the night, forced out of the helicopter wearing nothing but their underwear, and then given 24 hours to find their way back to base. Those that fail are forced to repeat the exercise over and over again until they either succeed or quit. But the Cabiles aren't just famous for their rigorous style of training. They're also famous for near-limitless cruelty. Although the practice has since been banned among its recruits, an old ritual of the Cabiles was to give the recruits a chicken to take care of throughout their 8-week training schedule. These chickens were kept in a coop not far from the recruits' barracks, who were charged with feeding them, cleaning their coop, and most importantly, naming them. Towards the end of their training, the recruits were told to go out to the coop and collect their beloved chickens for inspection, and then one by one, the recruits were told to take tight hold of their feathered friends and bite their heads off. The chickens are then fed to the recruits as their first fresh meat in almost 2 months. As you can imagine, this kind of training breeds soldiers capable of unspeakable acts of cold-blooded savagery, but that's exactly what their recruiters were looking for. The Guatemalan Cabiles brought many of their traditions to the Zetas, but one of them was ritual beheading. Having cut their teeth during the Guatemalan Civil War, the Cabiles struck fear into the hearts of their enemies by displaying the decapitated heads of those they'd killed on operations. However, these heads wouldn't be displayed as trophies back at their base. They'd be strewn over some prominent landmark in their enemy's heartland, as a warning. Being in the business of brutal intimidation, the Zetas adopted the Cabiles tactics, and from early 2000s onward, grisly executions such as beheading, flaying, or immolation became more and more commonplace. Every other cartel in Mexico was forced to adopt similar tactics in order to keep up with the Zetas' meteoric rise to power, such as the Jalisco New Generation cartel, who in September of 2011 dumped over 30 bodies on a busy avenue in the state of Veracruz. What we are seeing in Mexico is a process of paramilitarization in which different groups seek to wipe out their rivals, said Mexican organized crime expert Eduardo Buscalia, shortly after the Veracruz bodies were discovered. But without a shadow of a doubt, the organization which started this process of militarization was Los Zetas. What the story of the Los Zetas comes down to is that over the course of a decade, 13 disgruntled Special Forces soldiers rose to become the second most powerful narcotics traffickers in North America. They applied their elite, martial mentality to the most lucrative black market on the face of the earth, and in doing so, made the world a considerably more frightening place. Yet the original 13 Zetas didn't just become multi-millionaires by killing hundreds, if not thousands of people. They made an indelible mark on contemporary culture. From the beheading of Danny Trejo's character in Breaking Bad to the fully militarized cartel enemies in the latest Call of Duty games, the Zetas had made their mark on society and changed the geopolitical landscape of the United States border territories forever. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations.